Well, I'm very pleased to be here. I apologize that I'm going to speak to you in English. I think my German is not very good, so it would probably be more difficult for you to understand me if I spoke in German. I'm going to talk to you today about how I would view the situation at Tihange if I were still in the role of serving as a nuclear regulator, and focusing on really the issue of risk and the safety and how we go about understanding the safety of, in particular, of a new phenomenon. And I think the title of my talk is a little bit different. It's the safety of surprises. And I think it's important to understand that that is largely what we are dealing with here. Almost everything in this particular case is new and does not have a precedent in the nuclear safety world. So it's important to keep that in mind as we discuss and look at the issues. So I think when we talk about the safety, the first and most important issue that we have to understand is what exactly is the problem. In this case, we have indications and information about flaws in the reactor pressure vessel at Tihange and at Doel 3. And you'll hear from other speakers today about the technical aspects of those flaws. But what I'm going to focus on is what it means from a safety perspective and from a regulatory perspective and how we know and understand those issues. And one of the things that's important to understand throughout is what are the assumptions, what are the different features that we are assuming about these particular flaws. And as a regulator and from a safety understanding, we have to challenge those assumptions. And I think that's an area that's been lacking in this particular case. The other aspect, I think, is then to understand, if we understand that there are flaws and we understand what the cause is, then we need to understand what the impacts are and what kinds of challenges can occur. And we heard a little bit from Simone about the issue at play here, and it really is this idea of thermal shock and the potential for cracks within the reactor pressure vessel that could allow radiation and ultimately cooling water to leave the reactor vessel, which is a very difficult situation to control. So those are the two main ideas that I want to focus on, and how the first one in particular informs the second. So I think it's important that we understand this is not the first time in the history of the nuclear industry that new phenomena have been discovered. In particular, it's not the first time that we have seen issues of cracks, in particular or the potential for cracks or flaws in areas of the reactor pressure vessel. In the United States, we have a number of incidents over the history of the nuclear industry where flaws have developed in materials or in components in the reactors that have been surprising, that were not expected, and that have had to been addressed and dealt with. I listed a number of them here. One of the a number of the important ones involve steam generators. In the United States, we've had two plants that have had ruptures of the steam generators. And the steam generators are a component in the reactor which essentially isolate the radioactive material from the environment. And they play an important role in converting the energy from the reactor into energy for electricity. And in two cases, we had very severe incidents with steam generators developing cracks and ultimately having leaks. In one case that led to a long-term shutdown of a reactor and ultimately the replacement of steam generators. And in another case, it actually led to the shutdown of the reactor itself, because in analyzing the problem, it was very difficult to ultimately understand what caused the cracks to develop. And I think there are a lot of parallels between those incidents and what happened at Tihange and Doel. In the United States, there was a problem that was identified with the top of the reactor pressure vessel, the so-called vessel head. There were cracks that were developing because in certain weld areas in these vessel heads, and ultimately that led to the replacement of these vessel heads. So, as you can see, there's a pattern developing. In a number of other areas, there's a phenomenon with the metal that was used in a number of welds, also in elements of the reactor pressure vessel. there was the potential for cracks, and the result was a repair of the reactor pressure vessel. And then finally, the last incident, I talked about the steam generator ruptures and how they ultimately led to major changes to the plant. So the examples that I've given demonstrate a pattern, which is that flaws were identified in elements either in the reactor pressure vessel or in other components that are of equivalent safety significance and large components in the reactor. And in each case, in the United States, there was a process of reviewing the information, identifying the cause, and then ultimately coming up with a repair, replacement, or shutdown. So in almost all cases, because of the significance from a safety perspective of these components and the need for integrity of these components, unexpected and previously unexpected flaws were dealt with either equipment repairs, replacements, or ultimately plant shutdown. This is not the case for Tihange and Doel. So it is already something slightly different than what we've seen in similar cases in the United States. And I would add that in many cases, those flaws were potentially less significant than the types of flaws we're talking about for Tihange and Doel. So how did we get here? It's important to understand what I've called here, and I don't know if this translates well, but this is the luck of the inspection. No one was looking for this particular flaw at Tihange or Doel. And normally under the US regulatory requirements, which are also largely adopted by the Belgian regulator, an inspection of the type that was done that identified these particular flaws is not normally done. So the particular codes, the so-called ASME codes, which form the basis for much of the inspection regimes and the safety regimes for the reactor pressure vessels, do not require an inspection of what is the so-called base metal of the reactor pressure vessel. So this was done because of a particular issue that was identified related to a plant in France, and therefore they were doing this type of inspection to look for a different type of flaw. And what came out of it was a number of very unknown flaws within the reactor pressure vessel in Doel and Tihange. So there is a first issue as a safety regulator that I would want to understand is, does this occur in other places? And one of the areas that I find surprising with this whole issue is that there's not been more interest, in particular in the United States and in other areas, to do more inspections to try and rule out this kind of phenomenon and flaw in other reactors. That is something that appears to be missing, and I'll talk about that a little bit. So in this particular case, an inspection was done to measure just a very thin depth within the reactor pressure vessel to identify cracking with an area of material on top of the reactor pressure vessel. When these flaws were identified, then a full inspection was done that could look deeper into the reactor pressure vessel, and then the number of flaws that we've heard from Simone were identified, and the problems began. So what are the flaws? And again, you'll hear from many people who will go into more depth about the specific technical aspects of these flaws, but I want to talk about it from the perspective of a safety issue and a safety regulator, and how I think we should look at this issue, because we need to understand what the flaws are if we're going to understand what their significance is. So the consensus view right now, I would say, among the industry, certainly among the French regulator, the Belgian regulator, among the regulatory bodies in the United States, is that these flaws are the result of so-called hydrogen flakes, which we can understand best as a flaw that would have been introduced at the time of manufacturing. So this is a very crucial question to understand the risk and to understand the consequences for this particular type of problem, because a number of assumptions would then be made based on this understanding. The first and most important is that these flaws or cracks would not grow over time. That's a very, very important assumption that comes from the belief that these are hydrogen flakes, because they would have been introduced at the original manufacturing. Now, 30 years later, they've been identified, and the initial assessment of these flaws was that they were consistent with hydrogen flakes, and therefore the conclusion was that they had not changed over the 30-year lifetime of the reactor. And if we assume that, then we can also assume that therefore they're not going to grow in the future, and that impacts then how we assess and understand the risk. So this is a very, very important piece of information, and is probably the most important information. So the question is then, were they there initially, or were they not there initially? And in the nuclear safety world, and to understand the risk and the safety of a reactor pressure vessel, first and foremost, these vessels are inspected at the time of manufacturing, because cracks and flaws of this type are typically not accepted for a reactor pressure vessel, because of the important function that the reactor pressure vessel plays in the safety and the operation of the reactor. So there are two quotes that I pulled here for you that address this specific issue. And it is the language in blue, and I'll read them here. These came from the US NRC's assessment of this particular issue, how it would relate ultimately to plants in the United States. And I'm quoting their recollection, or their restating of what the French regulator had said. And what they say is that Electrabel reviewed all available fabrication records and determined that fabrication met all applicable codes and standards. So based on the information that we had at the time, the vessels were manufactured appropriately. And then most importantly, however, no explanation was given for failure of the manufacturing examinations to report the indications. So at the time that these were fabricated within the codes, this ASME code that is used to understand how to determine if a reactor vessel is appropriate, it is possible that there could have been some cracks and flaws, and that there could have been an argument made that in that case the vessel was still appropriate to be used. However, the records that were kept at the time indicate that there was no identification of the flaws at the time. Now, there's a couple of explanations. One, we could say that, in fact, the inspections were not done, but we don't have that indication. We have records that show that the appropriate inspections were done. And more importantly, we could say, well, perhaps they were identified and the decision was made that the vessel was still acceptable. But the conclusion today is that that would be highly unlikely that a component with such imperfections would have been accepted by any owner had the indications been properly recorded and reported, even if they were not rejectable under the ASME 3 standards. So the point is, if they were there at the beginning, they should have been identified and the vessel should have been rejected. So what does that mean? Well, again, let's take another look at the particular interpretation of this. And this was an independent review board that looked at the situation at Tihange, and what they concluded was the discrepancy between the indications reported in the acceptance reports of the rings from 1970s and in 2012 inspection in the core shells of the two plants remain unresolved. Since the UT, so this is the inspection technology available at the time, should have had the capacity to detect the indications found. So we have a consensus view that the cause of the flaws are hydrogen flakes. Therefore, they should have been, and we have an inspection regime that specifically looks for flaws of this type at the time of manufacturing, and yet they weren't found at the time of manufacturing. So this is an extremely important point that appears not to be relevant to the people making the safety decisions. So ultimately, what has come out of this examination and this analysis of the issue is that hydrogen flakes are the consensus source of the flaws, but they should have been identified and the vessels rejected. So I think, as somebody said yesterday in one of the talks, we cannot have both. Right? Either hydrogen flakes are the source, in which case they should have been identified. So there's a fundamental question still to be answered, which is, why were they not identified? And that's a very important issue, because the assumption about hydrogen flakes is not just that that is the nature of the problem, but it is an assumption about their growth over time. And if we assume that the flaws are static, that is a very different risk element than if we assume that they can grow and become even more significant over time. And we'll talk about that then in the last few minutes that I have. So there is this significant inconsistency that in my mind should have been resolved before any decision about the restart of the plant should have been made. Because ultimately this is a root cause analysis which needs to be done to understand the issue. And you cannot complete the root cause analysis if you have a blatant inconsistency in the cause of the particular issue. And in this case, that is the difference between information about the hydrogen flakes at the time of manufacturing when they should have been identified and the current understanding today. So right now, the consensus is that they have to be hydrogen flakes because they look like hydrogen flakes and we have no other understanding for how they could be there. But that's not a good way to go about looking at this issue. There's a good way to look at it if your goal is to try and get the plant restarted in as quickly a manner as possible. So, looking at this, the other point that should come out of this quite clearly is that globally there's clearly a need to do more of these kinds of inspections. Because if they were in fact present, the initial inspections did not identify them, which means that there may be more reactors out there that have these type of flaws, which in and of itself could potentially be an issue. So there are a number of outstanding questions here that still have yet to be answered. So if we think about this in terms of a root cause analysis, the root cause analysis is in my mind not complete. And if I were presented with this information, I would ask the staff at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to go back and do more work. Explain for me how these two issues resolve themselves. Because I could not present information to the Congress, to the public, that would give a satisfactory explanation about this fundamental inconsistency. So, the issue then becomes, what are the actual impacts from this kind of incident? Now, there certainly are situations in which flaws are identified, cracks are identified in components in reactors, material defects are identified, and they don't have a very significant impact on the overall safety of the reactor and the safety of the public. This is a very, very different kind of issue. The reactor pressure vessel serves two very important functions. One, it provides a vessel that can contain cooling water in order to provide a cooling mechanism to keep the reactor functioning during normal operations and, of course, during accident conditions. The second function that the reactor pressure vessel plays is in the event of an accident. It is, in the United States description of this, it is the primary barrier. It is the first barrier in our defense in depth against radiation releases to the environment. So it is the first barrier, well, I should say it's the second barrier. The cladding of the fuel is the first barrier. But it is the second barrier and one of the primary barriers to the defense of the public when it comes to radiation protection. So it is not a component that you can tolerate defects and flaws in. And the important issue here is whether those flaws would allow a breach of the barrier. So namely, you would have a crack that could go from the inside to the outside. And therefore, you could allow both radioactive materials and ultimately cooling water to escape the vessel. And under the operational conditions and the intense pressures and temperatures, cracks would likely develop and grow from small cracks, and you no longer have the ability to potentially cool the reactor. So this is potentially a very significant issue. And in the United States, the issue we consider this, as you heard from Simone talking about this, is the so-called thermal shock scenario, where under certain conditions you could introduce cold water, which as the material in the reactor ages, it becomes more and more susceptible to embrittlement or to cracking when that cold water is introduced. And so what you're trying to prevent is all of these cracks which already exist from joining up and creating a larger crack that would allow the pressure vessel barrier to be breached. And if that happens in the United States, in this scenario, we simply consider that to be an accident that would release radiation to the environment. You would have no way to cool the reactor fuel because water that you pour into the reactor vessel would only be able to go as high, essentially, as whatever cracks you have, and it would then leave the vessel at that level, and most of your reactor fuel would be left without cooling water, which would then overheat, and then ultimately you would develop enough pressure, which you would ultimately fail the containment. So and that means a release of radiation to the environment. So in the United States, when this issue is considered from a risk perspective, the only thing you worry about is how likely is it to get a crack in the reactor pressure vessel. Because if you get those cracks, you will melt the fuel, you will release radiation in the environment. It is not a condition that is easily dealt with by the safety systems that you have in the nuclear reactor. It's a so-called beyond design basis event, meaning it doesn't fall within that category. So, when we look at this, there is a tendency to want to consider this issue from the perspective of risk. And so what that means in many cases is people try and take two numbers and they multiply them together and they get a small number. And in fact, in the United States, when they looked at this issue, that's what they did. So they looked at the likelihood of given some assumptions about these hydrogen flakes, and again, no assumptions about an evolution in time with the cracks, but simply that they were static and the same as they'd always been. There was an examination, a study that was done, and it showed that even if these cracks were present, that the risk or the change in the likelihood of getting a crack that goes all the way through the reactor vessel was below the level that would be required in the United States to take particular action. But it was very close. It was within a factor of about 10. Now, given the uncertainties, that is not, to me, a comforting situation. And the other important point to keep in mind is that by looking at this number and making it a very small number, you're hiding a very important fact, which is that this is an accident that would lead to very significant off-site contamination. This is not an accident that would likely lead to a controllable or a manageable accident scenario. So by looking at this from a perspective of a risk number that looks very small, we talk about the risk as being very small. But I think what that does is that hides the reality of the situation, which is this is a very significant fundamental flaw in the reactor. If we were to take this reactor today and have produced it, this particular vessel, it would have been rejected and never allowed to go into service. Of course, it's very different as a regulator when you're dealing with in-service components and they develop these kinds of issues, but that's because sometimes regulators get caught up in too many formalities. But the fundamental issue is a vessel like this would never be allowed into service today. And that was the conclusion not of me, but of the independent review board that looked at this, of the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and ultimately of an interpretations of the existing pressure vessel codes. So fundamentally what we're dealing with here is a situation in which we have a still as yet unresolved analysis of the cause of these flaws, and we have a risk analysis or computer simulations that look at a number of factors that try to minimize the impact because the occurrence of the type of incident we're talking about is still very low. But the consequences are extremely severe. And I think it's time that we begin to recognize that trying to minimize the impact of those consequences is not really the right way to look at this from a safety perspective. And that's a lesson that I gained fundamentally from dealing with the Fukushima nuclear accident, where the consequences from that accident were extremely severe. But even today, if we go back and do analyses of how likely it is that the incident that happened is still very small, even though it happened. And once an accident happened at Tihange, it's not very comforting to talk to the communities that are displaced because of the radioactive contamination that the risk of this happening was very small. The reality at that point is it's happening, and you cannot minimize the hardship on the people that live around the plant by saying that the risk of this happening was small. The impacts are real. And in this particular case, there's still a tremendous amount of information that is unknown and unresolved. And in my mind, that does not then allow a justification on a risk perspective to allow continued operation. Fundamentally, people need to understand what's happening and why before they allow this plant to restart. And I think ultimately, if I were to look at this in the United States perspective, I think it would be very difficult for this plant to ever be restarted, that I would be bombarded with questions that I would not be able to satisfactorily answer, and ultimately then provide assurances that the plant could be operated safely, because there are still too many things that are unknown. And in my mind, that would have been the right approach here: continue to look, continue to address the issue, and ultimately come up with a corrective action. And I think sometimes we think about this, that there's only one solution. It's either operate or shut down. Well, no, there are solutions. You could produce a new vessel. You could potentially come up with repair mechanisms, perhaps. But none of those options appear to have been explored because simply they're too expensive and they would take too much time. So there are alternatives, but those alternatives are not likely to lend to a satisfactory solution if the goal is to restart the plant. But in the United States, having dealt with similar issues, I cannot see, with the kind of opposition and public concern that's been raised, that anything other than a shutdown of the plant would have been the outcome. because a replacement, a new reactor vessel, would have simply been too expensive to make it worthwhile. So that is kind of my conclusion. I appreciate your attention and your willingness to hear me out in English. So thank you very much.